Hamlet, Part 4. Rosemary for Remembrance. Hamlet's suspicions with regard to fresh villainy on the part of the king were justified. Claudius dared not do any harm to the young prince in his own country, for he was greatly beloved by the people. On the plea, therefore, that it was for the benefit of his health, he was dispatched to England. But letters were given to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, who accompanied him, commanding that on his arrival the prince should be instantly beheaded. Suspecting treachery, Hamlet managed to get possession of these letters, and in their place he put others, written by himself, in which the English government was begged as a favor to Denmark to put the bearers to death. Thus Rosencrantz and Guildenstern fell victims to their own treachery, and met the fate to which they were shamelessly conducting their old schoolfellow. The day after the changing of the letters, their ship was chased by pirates. Finding they were too slow of sail to escape, they made a valiant resistance. In the grapple, Hamlet boarded the pirates' vessel. At that very instant, the ships got clear, so he alone became their prisoner. They treated him well, knowing who he was, and expecting to get a good reward. And not long after he had left Denmark, Hamlet set foot again in his own country. He did not at first announce his return to the king and queen, but sent a message privately to Horatio, who at once hastened to him. During his absence from Denmark, a sad thing had happened. Poor Ophelia, overwhelmed by all the sorrows that had fallen on her, had lost her reason. Hamlet's strange behavior had been the first shock, and on her father's sudden death and Hamlet's departure for England, the slender strength snapped utterly, and the young girl was carried away in the full flood of calamity. Ever sweet and gentle as she had been all her life, Ophelia was so still. There was no violence or malice in her malady. She was indeed distracted with grief and spoke strange words. But when allowed her own way, she went harmlessly about, only decking herself with flowers and singing sweet and touching snatches of quaint old songs. The king and queen were deeply grieved at this new misfortune that had fallen on their young favorite, for the queen, at least, loved her tenderly. They had also grounds for uneasiness concerning themselves. Disquieting rumors began to be current. Rather foolishly, they had tried to hush up the cause of Polonius's death, and had had him hurriedly interred, without proper rites or ceremony. His son Laertes had come secretly from France, and tittle-tattlers were not lacking to pour into his ears malicious reports of his father's death. Finally, there was an attempt at insurrection. Laertes went to the palace, followed by a riotous mob, shouting, "Laertes shall be king! Laertes king!" They broke down the doors, overcame the guard, and Laertes forced his way into the presence of the king and queen. "O thou vile king, give me my father," he demanded with a menacing gesture. "Calmly, good Laertes," implored the queen, while the king, with all the subtle art in which he was so skilled, tried to soothe the infuriated young man, and asked him why he was so incensed. "How came he dead? I'll not be juggled with," cried Laertes fiercely, flinging off all semblance of allegiance. "Let come what comes, only I'll be revenged most thoroughly for my father." "Who shall stay you?" asked the king mildly. "My will, not all the world," retorted Laertes roughly. "And for my means, I'll husband them so well they shall go far with little." The king was just explaining that he was in no sense guilty of Polonius's death, when there was a stir at the door, and the next moment Ophelia entered. At the sight of the beautiful young maiden, in her simple white robe, her long yellow locks floating free on her shoulders, her sweet blue eyes opened wide in vacant gaze, a sudden check came to the young man's violence. "O Rose of May, dear maid, kind sister, sweet Ophelia," he murmured with tenderest pity. "O heavens! Is it possible a young maid's wits should be as mortal as an old man's life?" Ophelia carried flowers in her hand, and she came in singing and talking to herself. "They bore him barefaced on the bier, hey na nani nani, hey nani, and in his grave rained many a tear." Fare you well, my dove. Hadst thou thy wits, and didst persuade revenge, it could not move thus, said Laertes. Ophelia now began to distribute the flowers she held in her hand. First she gave some to her brother. "There's rosemary, that's for remembrance. Pray, love, remember. And there is pansies, that's for thoughts. A document in madness, thoughts and remembrance fitted," said Laertes. "There's fennel for you, and columbines," said Ophelia to the king. Fennel is an emblem of flattery, and columbines of thanklessness. "There's rue for you," to the queen, "and here's some for me. We may call it herb of grace on Sundays. Oh, you must wear your rue with a difference. There's a daisy. I would give you some violets, but they withered all when my father died. They say he made a good end. For bonny sweet Robin is all my joy." Thought and affliction, passion, hell itself, she turns to favor and to prettiness, said Laertes, as smiling and kissing her hand, the poor wit-bereft maiden went singing on her way. His desire for vengeance was redoubled, and he resolved that his sister's madness should be dearly paid for. He therefore lent a ready ear when the king declared that the blame of everything that had happened was due to Hamlet, explaining that he had been unable to punish him up to the present, owing to the intense love borne him by his mother and all the people. Even as they were talking, arrived a letter from Hamlet himself. It ran thus: "High and mighty, you shall know I am set naked on your kingdom. Tomorrow shall I beg leave to see your kingly eyes, when I shall, first asking your pardon thereunto, recount the occasion of my sudden and more strange return. Hamlet." Hamlet's return happened most aptly, and the king immediately suggested a plan whereby Laertes could gratify his vengeance without fear of being found out. While Laertes had been in France, he had been greatly talked about for his skill in fencing, and a Norman gentleman who had come to the Danish court brought a marvelous report of his prowess in the use of the rapier. This account filled Hamlet with envy. He was himself a master in the art of fencing, and he longed for Laertes to come back and try a match with him. The king now proposed that Laertes should challenge Hamlet to a trial of skill. He, being heedless, most generous, and free from all contriving, will not look closely at the foils, continued the king cunningly, so that with ease, or with a little shuffling, you may choose a sword unbaited, and in a pass of practice requite him for your father. Laertes not only consented to this dastardly scheme, he went a step further and declared that he would anoint the point of the rapier with some poison so mortal that no remedy in all the world could save from death the thing that was but scratched with it. He would touch the point of this sword with this poison, so that if he wounded Hamlet ever so slightly, it would be death. In addition to this, in case Hamlet should escape unhurt from the fencing, the king said he would have a chalice near with poisoned wine, so that if he grew thirsty and called for drink, he would meet his death in that manner. Their further plotting was interrupted by the queen, who came hurrying in with further tidings of woe. Ophelia was drowned. "Drowned? Oh, where?" cried Laertes. "There is a willow grows aslant a brook that shows his hoar leaves in the glassy stream," began the queen. And she told how Ophelia, having woven many fantastic garlands of wild flowers, had clambered into this tree to hang her wreaths on the drooping boughs when a branch broke, and Ophelia and her trophies fell into the brook. There, for a while, her clothes bore her up, and she floated down the current, still singing snatches of old tunes. But before she could be rescued, the weight of her garments, heavy with the water, dragged her down to death. Laertes could not restrain his tears when he heard of the loss of his dear sister. But the king guessed that his rage would soon start up with fresh fury, and he resolved not to lose sight of the young man till his scheme of vengeance was accomplished.